I do think that there is a logic that does connect conservatism to a tendency towards authoritarianism.
We have this sense of care and justice and compassion and empathy as being universal.
Well, hello, and welcome to another episode of Owls at Dawn. We are just two dudes from Southern California who studied philosophy, politics, and religion around the world and decided to start a podcast where we could bullshit with impunity. I am Austin Hayden Smith.
And I'm Troy Polidori.
And we're going to get into it this week, and we're going to talk about, authoritarianism and dogmatism and all kinds of fun stuff. But before we get into that, we're going to start off the way we start off every episode with the Shitty Minute. This week, it is Troy's turn to rant about whatever is chapping his hide for the week. So, T-Roy, the floor is yours.
I'm going to keep mine pretty short and sweet. What's grinding my gears this week is fucking Democrats.
Wait. You mean, actually fucking them? Or, as in, you're using that as an adjective?
No, yeah, just an adjective.
Okay.
They're not actually fucking. They're just
okay.
An expletive generally.
Okay.
Fucking Democrats. Except Bernie. I'll have to put that little exception in there for sure. Because, Bernie's out there marching in the Women's March. Where is Hillary? I'm sorry.
Didn't I hear that she started a TV show because she's going to try to run again in 2020?
Should the person who won the popular vote by 3 million votes and then lost because of a ridiculous technicality that no one actually understands why it's there in the first place, shouldn't she be the one who's out there actually, at least with the people? I mean, maybe not leading. I can understand that since they fucked up the campaign so hard, but out there doing something, not literally disappearing from the face of the planet, while Bernie's out there actually trying to do shit. And then not even, I don't mean this to be a Hillary bashing thing. It's all Democrats this way. The entire party is completely weak-willed. I mean, they're talking about, there's scuttlebutt about Democrats basically saying, well, we're going to vote for all the Trump's cabinet appointments because what's the gain from opposition? What's the gain from opposition? Literally, the last 8 years have been nothing but opposition from the minor party, and they won every single thing in government because of it. There's lots to gain from opposition, especially when your opposition is founded upon moral principles, unlike the GOP's was, and if you have a huge base that's supporting you in your opposition, which is exactly what they finally have, and they don't give a shit. At this point, I'm predicting they're probably not going to filibuster and block the Supreme Court nomination, which, because of some, political capital bullshit, we can't do that, or when we go high when they go low, some crap like that, which is such ridiculous bullshit. I don't even want to get into that, but it's just, I don't know enough about political science to say for sure it's just because no Democrats in the Senate are worried about being primaried in the next election, that those machinations just don't happen to Democrats.
Right.
I don't know if it's simply just that or that's just a smaller part of it. I don't want to do simple moralizing and say that all Democrats are just weak-willed and don't give a shit about anybody but themselves. Although it's probably true of all politicians generally, for the most part, But just it's frustrating to see that you have these massive protests and just constant 24/7 opposition from the general populace to the executive branch. And Congress is just whatever, next day, everything's the same. Rather than seeing this as we finally have a popular base of support to do this. This is the best time to mount opposition. And
I know. You want to see it doesn't have to be Trotsky, because I know people get afraid of that word, but you want to see someone like a Trotsky that just gets up, like Bernie Sanders is doing, like Elizabeth Warren tries to do, I think, but, where they can stand up and, let's get Keith Ellison and Cory Booker, and let's get some of these people to stand up and be like, this is the fucking time, okay? And get out on the streets. I don't see them on the streets. I don't see them with any passion and fire, and there's nothing at all that makes me drawn to anything that they're trying to sell. And if I'm not, and I'm already on the left, I can't imagine that someone who's on the fence or someone who's just becoming politicized or someone who could potentially become politicized, I can't imagine that it would somehow spark them to life in any meaningful sense.
Yeah, there's no sense in which, I mean, the world is, like, the country's primed for massive protest and opposition. Yes. Could not be more primed than it is now. It's just, it's aware, everyone's aware of it, that it's like everything's ready to be on fire. And, yeah, Congress has just got nothing going.
Well, do you think the bottom line is that they're just afraid of actual disruption? Because as much as people want to say, oh, Democrats, they're progressives, they're not, though. They really are about maintaining the status quo, because when you look at, I mean, just look at how much money Hillary Clinton raised from Wall Street and multinational corporations. This isn't some sort of vanguard party. You know, they are the party of the establishment. So in so many ways, I think what they're trying to do is they're trying to weather the Trump storm, and they think that he's going to shoot himself in the foot so badly that somehow people will just fall back into line and give them power. It's just about this weird shifting of the hands of power. And that's what the problem is, rather than actually trying to create any sort of meaningful socio-political or socioeconomic change.
Oh, 100%. I mean, yeah, the Democrats don't support the populace. They don't support people who have been disenfranchised or disenchanted with the entire political establishment. They represent business instability. And so if the Dow Jones is doing great, then for all intents and purposes, Democrats are pretty happy with it. And they just expect that, yeah, exactly, Trump will shoot himself in the foot. And then that was Hillary's entire campaign. Really, that guy? That was the campaign slogan, basically. And
that's what they're doing now.
That's what
they're doing now.
Yeah. We're not that guy.
Yeah.
That's it.
Or we told you he's crazy, but then everyone else is like, but that's okay. That's what we wanted. We wanted the crazy.
There's no positive vision whatsoever.
Yeah. What do you think, though? So do you have 2 or 3 voices other than Bernie? Like, do you think Elizabeth Warren is like, because I've heard recently, I know a lot of people have kind of been kind of critical of Elizabeth Warren, saying that she's not being strong. Whereas I know that she was pretty tough during the Senate hearings on, Betsy DeVos in particular, and on some of the other nominees. So do you think that she, because people like to think of her as this sort of great bastion for potential leftism, but she is kind of, I don't know, she's kind of seeming to not catch fire with everybody.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get too deep into it, but Warren has been more conservative on a lot of issues than I think people realize. Since her kind of hot button issues like banking and stuff, she's been much more liberal on. So yeah, I don't get into the nitty gritty, but
yeah,
I think it's exactly right that there needs to be a much stronger push on Democrats, some pressure on them. Like, let's do some of the shit the Tea Party did. Like, threaten to primary Democrats who do stuff that doesn't fall in line with what the base actually wants.
Yeah. The problem is, I think that everybody that's already representing, whether they're at the state level or they're at the federal level, in the House or in the Senate, that for the most part, I would say that they're already so geared towards being pro-establishment that type of threat I don't think would really compute with them. I think they would maybe try to compromise, but in their core, they're the wrong people. I think we need new people. I think that we have a system that funnels a particular type of person into either the Republican or the Democrat, center left, center right, but really they're not that different across the aisle from one another. I know at the bases try to argue that there's this big civil fucking war. It's really not that different, I mean, Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell might play this game in the media, but I think behind the scenes, really, their pharmaceutical buddies and their oil buddies and their Wall Street buddies are all kind of, it's all in the same little network or zone of difference, if it is a difference. Or a zone of similarity, and so it's just about a slight degree of difference. And so I think it's the wrong people. I think new people need to come in. I think that's the only solution. And if there are people who are more fringe, who could potentially are teetering on a sort of more radical leftist type of disposition, then those are the ones that might feel that pressure. But I think the majority wouldn't, because they would just compromise a little bit, but then ultimately they'd fall back into the same habits.
I think that's mostly true, that it's systemic, and largely just about money in politics, right? But at the same time, you can exert pressure on at specific times and areas based upon threats of those things. I know the one cabinet appointment that's been under the most fire is DeVos on education, right? And that's largely because there's been this huge outpouring of people who have called to express their discontents. And so there's been even a couple of Republicans, I think, who have kind of fallen out of line.
Two.
Because of that.
Two Two Republicans came out and said, I can't remember, one of the congresswoman from Alaska, and then I can't remember where the other woman was from. But yeah, both of them came out and said that, they can't, in good faith, vote for her.
So you know what? Protests, they work. Call on your senators and call on your representatives. It works. We got to just not fall asleep at the wheel, not get sick of it, which is going to be tough because fatigue's going to set it. It's already set in. It set in with me like 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
You got to have shitty minutes every week, just like we do on the show. Keep that blood pumping. All right, so for our main segment this week, we're talking about authoritarianism. Yeah. So I noticed that Politico had an article by Matthew McWilliams in January of last year, of 2016, a little over a year ago, where Matthew McWilliams had talked about authoritarian personalities. So the specific personality type that's prone more towards authority and submission to authority, specifically holding to absolute authority as sort of indivisible, and various other things that we associate with that sort of authoritarian personality. And that's surprisingly, unlike it had been 30 or 40 years ago, authoritarians had drifted largely towards the Republican Party, where it used to be a little bit more equally distributed between political parties in the past. And that this was especially and statistically significant with Donald Trump supporters. And this is, of course, a year ago, long before there was any sense that Trump was really actually a viable candidate, let alone the winner of the election. And McWilliams had said that basically his thesis in this article is that we should not take this lightly because authoritarian personalities are a larger segment of the population than we generally think. And if they're so statistically prone towards this strong man, Trump, then absolutely a person like him could get elected here, even though he seems like such an outlier compared to past presidents, even candidates who run for the presidency in general. And I read this article last week and thought it was pretty interesting to look at it in retrospect. A year later, one of the few, although it's a short form article, it's certainly not incredibly in-depth, actually kind of making the case that we ended up being correct afterwards, when some of us were so incredibly surprised such a thing could happen.
Yeah, it was really interesting. So he actually says that it was like the single statistically most significant variable of whether or not you would be a Trump supporter versus a non-Trump supporter. And so, and I don't think that just means that you would be a Republican versus Hillary, because like you said, at this point, it's early on in the primaries. So it would be Trump over Rubio or over Kasich or over Christie or any of the other potentials, Cruz, Bush.
Especially Bush.
Yeah, exactly, because he seems to be very agreeable, maybe?
Yeah, effeminate was the term used a lot for him, right? Yeah, a cuck.
Oh, did they? Were they? Oh, God. Yeah, well... Yeah, I can see that he's kind of got like a dopey smile on his face. He's kind of like, oh, okay, you can fuck my wife. That's cool. Yeah. And so he basically said that if you look at the single most, what he saw as sort of like important or significant variable, it's this idea, this tendency towards authoritarianism. And so it makes me wonder, what is authoritarianism, right? He says, the causes of authoritarianism are still debated. And he kind of talks about some of the characteristics. And some of the characteristics he mentions are that authoritarians obey, they follow perceived strong leaders, they respond aggressively to outsiders, especially when they feel threatened, right? And so it's really been making me wonder, okay, so that's great, but those are all symptoms, right? And those are all things that Trump obviously capitalized on, the fear of the other, the fear of the Mexican immigrant, the fear of the refugee, the fear of the other party and their allegiance to Wall Street, which is ironic, but right, that sort of thing. He was using this constant campaign of fear so that he could rally support around people who felt threatened. And he was able to really do that. He was able to really appeal to people who felt threatened. And that's why it was so successful. That's why I think I told you a few weeks ago, I was listening to a guy talk who was actually saying that Trump is one of the most successful public speakers he's ever heard, even though he's kind of got that fumbling, inarticulate cadence and vocabulary.
The word salad.
Yeah, it's the word salad. But for some reason, people are like, that's right. I heard so many people during the campaign and during the election cycle basically say things like, he just says what I'm thinking. And so he's able to somehow connect to quote unquote real America, at least enough in the states that it mattered the most, right? And so I've just been wondering, so what is it? What is the cause of authoritarianism? What is the logic, if you will, of authoritarianism, so that we can really understand what the fuck this even means? Like why people would be gravitating towards it. What is the sort of structural underpinning that manifests as I'm going to say things, off the cuff and, from my chest, and I'm going to be a strong leader. Where does all that even come from?
Yeah, McWilliams says that the survey that they use to kind of weed out authoritarians from other personalities had 4 basic questions where it was asked, would you rather have a child who is respectful or independent? Would you rather have a child who's obedient or self-reliant? A child who is well-behaved or considerate? And then a child who is well-mannered or curious.
So okay, kind of do those again and ask me what I would say.
Okay, so a child who's respectful or independent.
That's actually a tough one. Because sometimes I feel like independence is a weird sort of trope that people throw around that's kind of bullshit. But then respectful.
Don't overthink it.
Yeah. Okay. Then I'll just say independent, because respectful, I get what they're saying. It's a sort of power move. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think independent, they're just referring basically to makes their own decisions, isn't going to just follow for the sake of following. Which I'm pretty sure, knowing you, that's what you would, given your own inclinations.
Yeah. I know. Well, see, this is what's tough. When I've actually been called one time for a poll in my life, like by Gallup, and they were asking me these simple questions, and I'm like, doing the philosopher thing. I'm like, well, what does it mean by that? Because I'm like, I'm sure the woman that was giving me the poll was like, just fucking answer the question, please.
Yeah, there's several ways you can interpret this, the actions that would derive from this term. So what exactly are you referring to? Okay, so obedient or self-reliant?
Oh, self-reliant.
Yeah, you don't want some like sucking on the nipple at 30 years old, kind of thing.
No.
Well-behaved or considerate?
Considerate, 100%.
Oh yeah, of course. Well-mannered or curious?
Curious. You kidding me? I'm a fucking philosopher.
Yeah, see, so you're answering all the openness to experience answers, which is the opposite of the kind of authoritarian personality. Whereas the first option in all those is authoritarian. Respectful, obedient, well-behaved, well-mannered. All based on order and authority. Whereas the latter options, independent, self-reliant, considerate, and curious, are based on care and openness to experience. And so that's how they weeded those out.
Remember, you actually turned me on to this, and for some reason, I forgot the guy's name right now, but he wrote that book about the divided mind, the divided brain, I mean. Ian McGilchrist, is that his name?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Ian McGilchrist kind of talks about how the history of left-right brain narratives kind of got it wrong, that we actually use the whole brain, but there is still a way in which the left and right brain do sort of respond in particular ways. And it had to do with something that kind of maps onto this, right? Because I don't remember which side was which, but one side of the brain was primarily for compartmentalizing and for systematizing, whereas the other one was much more about an open disposition and that what was it again? I mean, you would be able to articulate a little bit better than me, but it was something along those lines.
Yeah, you call it the master and the emissary, right? And I think that the real key here is it's kind of trading on these ideas of moral foundations, where moral foundation theory is kind of psychological theory. I think Jonathan Haidt is one of the progenitors of this, and that there's kind of 6 basic moral foundations that we all have. We're all kind of pre-programmed to have them in some way, and then experience, especially when we're young, sort of situates which of them usually tends to be strongest in our adult life. So you have one is care. I was talking about those things like being considerate, for example, and being compassionate towards others. That's care. Second is fairness. So you want justice and equality. You get kind of upset when you see inequality or cheating, things like that. levels of unfairness. Third is liberty, so sort of individual choice. And those three are kind of usually thought to be more on the liberal side, although libertarians obviously prefer liberty usually kind of above everything else. But care and fairness especially tend to be more on the liberal side. And Haidt even says in his studies that the liberals tend to prefer care and fairness as the only moral sort of foundations, and that the last three here aren't really even moral at all. Those three are loyalty, so kind of in-group versus out-group, authority, so hierarchy and tradition, and then purity. So what do you avoid touching, involving yourself with, that kind of thing. And so liberals tend to think that care and fairness are the two moral issues, right? And everything kind of comes from that. And that loyalty, authority, and purity aren't moral. And if they ever are, really it's just because they are care and fairness when you get down to it. So you don't even need those anyway. They're just husks. Whereas conservatives tend to think that all of them together are kind of equal. So purity and authority and loyalty matter just as much as caring for people and justice.
Interesting. Huh. Do you think there's a way to investigate that even further, to say, okay, so what are the conditions even prior to that? Like what are the sort of forces that have led to the emergence of those 6 categories, which obviously we'll just take as sort of heuristics right now, right? They're not like absolute categories, but they're sort of interesting categories to engage in so that we can jump into a discussion. Do you think that there's a way, like, what are the forces that underlie that? And the reason I ask that is because I kind of have something that I've been thinking about for a long time, but I kind of want to ask you on this first before I jump into it, just to see what you would say.
Yeah, I mean, that was obviously my question too, the philosophical question, right? Because Haidt makes a point to say that every culture that they studied, they did this in South America, in the Middle East, in Asia, in Russia, in Africa, in Canada, and everywhere. And everywhere you see the exact same thing. Those on the liberal side of the spectrum prefer care and fairness, and the other things are not considered moral. And conservative spectrum tends to, and there's like a spectrum, and it's linear the whole way through. So they thought this is really, really predictive and basically universal. So does that mean that we're kind of hardwired, in a sense, to think this way?
Okay, so here's my big theory that one day I really want to do a study on this. And I know other people have done things, but I kind of want to explore this more. I think that this could really, in a very simple sense, be boiled down to reflective consciousness or meta-consciousness, linguistic consciousness. I think that in a very simple sense, and I'm going to totally kind of mix various different theories here because I kind of wrote down some notes when I was thinking about this, and these are just the stream of consciousness thoughts that came out before we started recording here. But I was thinking about, in Buddhism, the idea of attachment versus disattachment, right? And I've been thinking that maybe there's this idea that the Buddhist thinkers have hit upon, that attachment is that thing that necessitates suffering, and so the alleviation of attachment is the alleviation of suffering. And what it is that attachment does is attachment binds us to the concepts that language imposes, or that language creates and then imposes, right? And so what that ultimately comes from is from the human fear of chaos, the human fear of nature. And so animals fear chaos in nature too, but because of the different levels of cognition and the different ways that their cognitive faculties flow or function, it manifests itself in different ways. Whereas for humans, because of linguistic consciousness, I think that maybe one of the essential, if not the essential identity marker of what language does, is that it tries to make sense of or understand or control, which I think that in one way, rationality, understanding, all of those things are elements of control. Understand and control the world that is outside of our control. And so you can take this back to religious narratives, and you look at the myth of the flood, for example. Whether it's the Gilgamesh myth or whether it's the myth of Noah from the Old Testament, it's this idea that nature is fucking scary, okay? And nature can kill you. And so what do? You create a myth or a narrative to try to understand it and to try to conceptualize something that is outside of our abilities of comprehension, just in a sort of instinctual sense. And because humans have that ability to do so linguistically, we create these very elaborate and complex stories or myths or identities. And ultimately what it does is it creates these restricting signs that then, of course, try to control life, history, and nature. So maybe that humans, because of consciousness, are necessarily geared towards some level of authoritarianism. You know, the idea of control and the idea of mastery. But it then just becomes a question of degree. So to what degree do quote-unquote liberals manifest their authoritarian tendencies versus someone who might be more geared towards an explicit authoritarianism, like someone who would vote for Trump or a Donald Trump, or someone who would support a dictator, or someone who is a dictator. Does that make sense? And then, of course, there's a massive variation between those poles.
Yes, there's a lot there. I think that, first of all, the implication we should kind of make explicit is that with that moral foundations theory, we're kind of saying authoritarianism then would just be the conservative side, but extreme, like really high on the loyalty and authority and purity, so much so that care and fairness almost don't even matter anymore. Because the normal conservative, even kind of far conservative view was that all six foundations are kind of equal. Whereas the authoritarian obviously wouldn't even have a sense of sort of care anymore, since usually authoritarians like enjoy punishing people, and they enjoy inequality, especially if it makes people suffer. So, or certain people they don't like suffer. So that's a more extreme side. We're not kind of equating regular conservative moral intuitions with authoritarianism. Those are obviously not the same thing.
Right. But we're trying to understand the undergirding logic that would then lead to these various expressions.
Yeah, exactly. And so now with you said, I'm kind of interested to tease this out because there's a lot there and I'm not positive I'm completely following.
Okay.
So I absolutely agree that a lot of this comes down to order. Big picture order and chaos, right? So Buddhism does a great job of kind of exploring this in saying that kind of the cause of human suffering is this desire to bring order to a part of the world where we can't, right? Specifically,
right.
Our wants and our desires and our attachment to the world outside of us. Even our own self, being a self, it's not. And so, they have the anatman. We're not actually an atman, a soul or a self. Now, you could kind of bring that back into this authoritarianism or discussion of authoritarianism by saying, well, the authoritarian just needs to do some meditation, right? They need to. They're probably somebody who had authoritarian parents, and that they were sort of abused, or they were told they had to follow a set of strict, indivisible rules that could never be abrogated, or else they were physically beaten or punished or told they were worthless or whatever. And so now they kind of project that onto weaker people in society, or people that think are weaker, to sort of follow in that mold. That's usually the story that's told about authoritarian personalities and how they develop. The Buddhist kind of answer to that would be through, the Eightfold Path and meditation and things. You would be able to actually remove yourself from that and no longer be attached to trying to control the world that way by making people suffer, which really means you're suffering. And somehow you think it's going to end your suffering, but it's not. It's just going to kind of prolong it.
Right.
Is that sort of what...
Well, and part of that has to do not just with kind of explicitly then saying what the positive thing is. It's aligning yourself to the flows of reality, recognizing that everything is united, that everything is one, that there are these sort of uncontrolled, chaotic flows, and you attune yourself to the rhythms, if you will, of reality. And that's what you do by disattaching. That's what you do by overcoming the attachments, is you then attune yourself positively to those flows, so that and as cheesy as this might sound, Bruce Lee was fucking God in so many ways, but be like water, right? What he talks about, he's like, if you look at water, he's like, you put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. You put it into a bowl, it becomes the bowl. And that's a metaphor, obviously, for much of Eastern philosophy, from which he derived a lot of his I guess we'll say his spiritual teachings that undergirded a lot of his physical teachings as well. But there's something in that about coming alongside and dispositionally realigning yourself with the chaos rather than fighting against it. And I think that human nature, if there is such a thing, and I don't think that there is such a thing as human nature in the sort of traditional sense, but if there is something that is a human tendency, I think that it is restricted by linguistic consciousness that prevents us from becoming or comporting ourselves to that flow of openness and creativity and experimentation that reality actually is in its expression. Or I should say that reality is becoming, right? So very process philosophy, and it's about kind of coming alongside that process and transforming the way that we think and the way that we feel and the way that we speak so that we can reduce our tendency towards restricting the flows of life, nature, and history. Or, in other words, reducing our tendency towards that logical disposition that would eventually lead to, in its extreme case, to authoritarianism. So it's about this sort of radical eradication of hierarchy and control and the need to understand, in one sense, so that we can align ourselves with these sort of chaotic processual flows of reality. So it's a different type of understanding. It is an understanding, but it's not a controlling understanding. It's a different logical disposition.
Okay, now here's my kind of issue with the general Buddhist philosophy, though, is, Buddhism is basically, in kind of your Deleuzean reinterpretation of it, it's bent towards happiness, finding a sort of you use the word flow, right? But flow in the Deleuzean sense is different than the word flow in like psychology, where you find a flow state.
A flow state?
Yeah.
Right.
And that's kind of where it's thought that, individual fulfillment and happiness and maybe eudaimonia exists in that flow state, right? I think as far as it goes, that's certainly true. But I also have this feeling that tends to sometimes, as much as it can lead you towards personal individual fulfillment and happiness, can also be passive in the face of structural injustice. And I always think of like how a number of sort of larger Buddhist communities and Buddhist states, obviously not all of them, were kind of complicit in a number of kind of terrible acts in like Southeast Asia and in other places, and in Japan. And so, not that Buddhism necessarily causes those things at all, but that there's a bit of a tendency to kind of be withdrawn and to not seek out a positive justice,
right?
But rather the assumption that with individual fulfillment, sort of like Dalai Lama style, you want others to have that too, because then that adds to your own peace. It's kind of this like enlightened hedonism, in a way, right? Because you want others to be hedonistic as well, and so you kind of help them on the path because it helps you, and this sort of reciprocity happens there. And that's great and all, but I do worry that doesn't have a positive vision of justice, like what a good world looks like. It's more just that good world, that justice happens it's like derivative of individual fulfillment, or it happens as a byproduct, which I'm not confident it does.
Yeah. Now, do you think that that's something that's necessary to the Buddhist logic, or do you think that that's just maybe something that has been an oversight in their zeal to find ways to tear down or eradicate suffering, that they've neglected maybe this other component that we could marry together with kind of the idea of detachment from the world?
I don't want to generalize, because obviously Buddhism is huge and has a long history. It's like saying, what is Christianity? That could be a million different things. But I do think that even from the beginning, the Sangha communities in Buddhism were strictly hierarchical. And there's only a certain number of monks who get to, enjoy the process of enlightenment. Everybody else kind of has to serve them. And so you had this whole other stream of Buddhism, Mahayana, which ends up in Asia, which kind of counters this traditional form, is all about compassion and the bodhisattvas and caring for people. But then it's totally, for the most part, nowhere near as kind of doctrinally Buddhist as what we're talking about now. It's sort of incorporates all sorts of East Asian traditional religions and then all sorts of other stuff. And so I do think there's a sense in which I always think of like just the kind of battle between Confucianism and Buddhism when it first gets to Asia. And you have this sort of traditional order-based ethical religion in Confucianism, right? How do you just act in society appropriately? And there's not a whole lot of metaphysics or anything. And then Buddhism comes in and it's like a society destroyer, right? Individuals can sort of have the power to save themselves, and you don't need society. You need to, be detached from these things. And they're kind of at odds in this way. And I see the same sort of battle happening in these things we're talking about now, right? Where it's like, does it have to be like order versus chaos? Does it have to be either it's traditional hierarchical conservative order, or it's just getting into the flows of chaos and enjoying the way the world actually is, which is not orderly? I don't know that it really has to be. I mean, I'm too Hegelian to think that it's got to be the thesis or the antithesis.
Sure. Yeah, well, I think also it's different because you're talking about prescriptively, right? And you're talking about the sort of like Buddhist positive prescription for overcoming of suffering. Whereas I was more appealing to the Buddhist tradition to sort of just paint an analogy of the way that they talk about attachment and why attachment and what could it maybe be that they were honing in on, or that they do hone in on in that bedrock of the idea of locating suffering to attachment. And then my larger appeal to the idea that this is just something that is the fucking product, the byproduct of consciousness. In a very sort of Rust Cole sense from True Detective when he says that I think that consciousness was a tragic misstep in the history of evolution. Yeah, I think that's the fucking point, is that we are destined to suffer in some ways because of this tendency of language to need to control. And so there's something about reflective consciousness that is always going to control. Now, once we understand that, then I think that actually is freeing. Because then you get the idea, like Sartre says, you're condemned to be free. A lot of people are like, oh, it's a positive thing. No, that's not necessarily a positive thing or a negative thing. He's making an ontological statement there when you're condemned to be free. It's this idea that there's a constraint, the material constraints of consciousness, and then those material constraints of consciousness necessitate the fact that consciousness is going to overcome the current situation towards the new field of possibles. And then what happens when you get to that new field of possibles? There's the restraints again. And then, of course, it's all couched in this structural constraint of the way that it works. Condemned to be free. The perpetuation of this same cycle. And so I think that that's what we get. And so for me, it isn't the sort of absolute flattening prescriptively. It isn't about that we need to just absolutely flatten all hierarchies and then just attune ourselves simply to the chaos of the flows out with any recognition that we also need to system build. But it's the idea that at the very least, from an analytical perspective, when we understand what is it that leads to authoritarianism, maybe it's because of that tendency that sides with one that is like conceptual reflective thought over the other, which is attuning ourselves to the process of the world, which then leads to maybe prescriptively the answer isn't about going to one side or the other, whereas authoritarianism is on one side in a radical sense, as opposed to the other side, which is just pure schizophrenia in the Deleuzian sense, right? Or schizoanalysis, which is just this pure sort of release of jouissance and let's just be fucking crazy hedonists. And I'm not sure that that's the answer either. And I don't think actually Deleuze says that, but I think that could be like a certain reading. But some people might think that. And if he does do that, again, I think it's just for heuristic purposes to try to tear down and challenge things. But I think more than anything, it's about the idea of recognizing, if you will say in the Hegelian sense, the dialectical relationship between those two tendencies. And so that's why it's about perpetually, and this is where my research has always kind of, or at least for the past few years, has been hovering around, is this idea that we need to think, and we need to system build, and we need to create theories, but we need to also recognize that all of those theories need to be constantly disrupted by the flows that are undergirding it, that are constantly disrupting the truth, with a capital T, of all of those things, and then tearing down the truth of those things and revealing the flows of perpetual recreation as we create new systems and new thoughts. And then it's the same process over and over again. Creation, disruption, unpacking, unfolding, recreating, experimenting, attuning ourselves more to the flows. And then when we get too hedonistic, we pull back and we system build. And then you get too systematic and then you kind of like dive into hedonism a little bit. And it's this perpetual figuring shit out,
This sounds like your weekend, Austin.
Yeah, dude.
Okay, so I'm totally with you, but we're getting a little abstract, so I want to bring it back down, pull us out of the
Please.
clouds a little bit, and get us back on the ground a little bit. Okay, so I think we can kind of use what we're talking about here with this dialectical relationship and back and forth to this is what I was thinking about with this whole moral foundations thing, which I think is kind of the bedrock of where the authoritarian personality comes from. You have the argument of, well, if we have these moral foundations, well, what's correct then? What's the best way to do it? The prescriptive, as you were talking about earlier, right? I feel like the basic liberal argument is that loyalty and authority and purity and these things just are not moral, right? They're sort of tools that sort of evolution largely has used to keep our tribes alive, and that we still use them today, even in like sports, right? Whereas care and fairness are sort of actual moral foundations, true ones, and everything else is just husks, then tools that were once used but we don't need anymore. Since we can kind of be self-aware enough to know that we shouldn't blow each other up or kill each other because we look different. Right. Whereas the conservative,
we're at like a higher ethical plane, so to speak.
Yeah, we're not the tribal level where we have to have in-groups and out-groups or else the other tribe might eat us.
Right, okay.
Whereas the conservative argument is it's naive to think that we're ever going to need to do away with those things. So you need to have things like loyalty, patriotism, for example, authority, unquestioned authority like a cop, even if sometimes they abuse their power or whatever, and purity. So like the sexual moralizing that happens from moral conservatives, for instance, in religion. You need those things as sort of tools, even though they're maybe not inherently moral. That's fine. You need those tools to keep order, because if you lose order, you lose everything. Right? You can't get it back at that point.
Exactly. And that's why Christians are so drawn to this type of thinking, right? Because Christian thought is essentially dogmatic because they believe that human nature is fallen, and therefore you need some sort of transcendent restriction on the flows of chaos.
Protestantism especially, definitely has this this tendency.
Yeah, the Catholic mystics, they're kind of down with that chaos a little bit, like Meister Eckhart and shit.
Yeah, St. John the Cross, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Or even like Henri Nouwen and stuff like that. What were they called? What was his school called? Those new fuckers. Yeah, they're kind of down with that chaos a little bit.
That was the reason why Protestantism barely ever took a hold in France. You just can't get down with that order stuff.
Interesting. Yeah, I agree with you 100%. I think, and I want to be careful too, because I don't want it to sound like I'm somehow suggesting, and I don't think that we're suggesting that conservatives are necessarily authoritarian assholes. But I do think that there is a logic that does connect conservatism to a tendency towards authoritarianism. Now, that doesn't mean that Democrats, let's be clear, we're not talking about political parties here, Republicans versus Democrats. That doesn't mean that Democrats can't be authoritarian. They absolutely can be. It has to do, again, with the sort of disposition of your consciousness, and that there is something about authoritarianism that attaches really well and that appeals really well to certain types of individuals more than to others. Someone like myself, for example, authoritarianism is gross, and it's nails on a chalkboard. I have an instinctual reaction to it. Whereas maybe 10 years ago, maybe I didn't, because I wasn't quite as politicized in the way that I am now. And so I was a little bit more inclined to be respectful rather than compassionate. Even though I think I was always kind of a softie. My mom raised me. My mom's a hippie. My dad's a little bit more of the authoritarian type. So I think I kind of tread both of them. But definitely now I'm much more on the side of, the other end of the spectrum as opposed to an authoritarian logic. And I think that's what's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, again, just to be clear, to reiterate what you're saying, we're not at all saying that conservatism leads to authoritarian tendencies. Definitely not.
No.
It's just that if we're looking at this moral foundations theory, if liberals prefer care and fairness as being moral issues and everything else really isn't, or is derivative of that, whereas the normal conservative mindset is that all those things, authority, loyalty, fairness, and care, all matter. So you're saying, you used to be kind of both compassionate and respectful, kind of equally. That's a more conservative mindset, right? Those are equally important. Whereas authoritarian mindset doesn't even have care and fairness as being hardly important at all. Whereas loyalty and authority are paramount. It's kind of the completely inverted of the liberal
Right.
mindset in that sense. And we could talk about if there's a authoritarianism of the left. That would be interesting to talk about. That's a little bit beyond, I think, what we can do right now.
Yeah.
But I'm not against the idea on its face that that's possible. That would be interesting to talk about. But I do want to ask, like, do you think there's any way to kind of adjudicate between these two? If I'm correct in setting out those arguments, the liberal argument is that care and fairness are actually moral issues and everything else is derivative, whereas the conservative argument is that that's naive to believe that because we always need these tools like hierarchy and authority and purity to keep order. Otherwise, we lose that and we're no longer human anymore without societal order. Then is there a way to actually make a case for one or the other? Or is it basically just this is how your psychological profile and there's nothing you can do about it?
I mean, I do think there is a case. I would be pressed to develop what that case would be right now, but I think it would have to be something along the lines of recognizing that even within, let's say, a very sort of repressive, quote-unquote, tradition, a puritanical, reformed Christian tradition, there are individuals who still tend towards the idea of care and compassion. Look at a pastor like John Piper. Now, I'm not, for anyone out there, I'm not suggesting that you go out and start worshiping at the feet of John Piper. But I will say that John Piper was someone who actually was an extremely important figure for me in my politicization, as crazy as that sounds.
Yeah, in a circuitous way, yeah.
Yeah, John Piper and Francis Chan and Mark Driscoll and Doug Padgett and Brian McLaren, even though those guys would hate to be couched together. But they all were, let's start with Francis Chan and John Piper, they were Christian. They were reformed, in the sort of typical puritanical Protestant austere tradition. But yet John Piper's whole thing is that he wants to be happy. That's his whole thing. And his happiness, his individual happiness, is not at odds with the idea of glorifying God, because God wants us to be happy in our glorifying of God. So you were talking about, those when you were talking about the child rearing things. From a John Piper perspective, I think it would always be both. Like he always would talk about this example, like when the father says, go wash the car, and you're like, fine, and you drag your feet and you go wash the car. He's like, that's not love. He said, it's if someone's like, hey, will you wash the car for me? And you're like, of course I'll wash the car for you. I want to wash the car for you because I love you and I want to honor you in washing. Now there's a subtle power play that could be within that. Yeah, there could be an insidious guilt in that, but it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be, right? Now the way he was wielding it, I think there was, but I think that's just because of the structure of Protestantism that he couldn't escape from. But I think there is a move in the direction of this idea that he's trying to connect at a non-hierarchical level by appealing to the intrinsic desire for human happiness that he felt and that he struggled with as a young boy, and this idea of also trying to be obedient so that he doesn't go to hell and burn for the rest of his life. So I think that indicates that there is a way to adjudicate between the two, that people, even within those sort of austere traditions, are also struggling with this. And that's why you get then the break of the sort of emerging church with Doug Padgett and Brian McLaren, and they sort of went to the other side of it, right? They were like, fuck the authoritarianism, dogmatism of the church. Let's just go with like the feel-good openness, sort of pseudo-postmodern, post-structuralist Christianity stuff. But I think, again, there is something there that can adjudicate between the two, because I think that there is something that we feel about that in our human communities as we connect empathically. And I know I talk about empathy all the time, and it sounds like I am just a one-trick pony, and maybe I am. Fuck it. It's a good trick to have. Empathy, man. When you're out there and you serve and you are dealing with people who are suffering and broken, and then you look at the dogmatic tradition that tells you that those people are going to hell just because they've never heard the message of Jesus or whatever. I know that's kind of a trope and that's easy to tear apart, but I think there's something useful in that. It creates a question in your mind, and you think and you wonder, but God, like, how can I feel something for this person in a way that exceeds the restrictions that the hierarchical, authoritarian, dogmatic tradition enables me to comprehend. And what is that? And that little seed can create something beautiful. It's a germ that can create a flower of figuring out a balance between those two.
I like that you brought up that a lot, because I was thinking of the same thing when I was kind of ruminating in my mind about how would you make an argument for maybe care and fairness being these kind of universal moral foundations and everything else is derivative. And I was thinking, I came from the same place, right? Where John Piper, I remember, had once made a remark that I believe, this may have been apocryphal, but he and his family lived somewhere in the ghettos of in Michigan. I think it was Michigan where their church was, right? And not in the ghettos necessarily.
No, I think he was in Pennsylvania, right?
Was it Pennsylvania?
I thought so. Bethlehem Church in Pennsylvania.
Oh, okay, I don't remember, but anyway, it was not the ghettos necessarily, but somewhere that was definitely not upper class.
It was an urban environment for sure. Definitely urban, like lower socioeconomic status.
And he basically came out at one point and just said anyone who's a pastor and considers their ministry to be legitimate and lives in the suburbs around rich people is a hypocrite, more or less. I was like, damn, that was harsh, but that's so true. And I looked around and was like, everybody else who's like a famous pastor exactly is that. And they live, even the president of our own college, I had been not into his house, but I'd seen where his house is, and it's huge, and it's
I had been into his house
from everything. Yeah,
remember I dated his niece for a little bit, so I had been into his house.
And so I was like, that's 100% true. How could you ever think otherwise? And it kind of came to me, and I was like, I'd always had this sort of liberal streak. I think the same as you did, where we cared about social justice issues and thought they were completely consistent with our religious preferences, and didn't understand why other people thought otherwise. And that those issues and the hypocrisy we saw amongst a lot of the elites in our own experience, in the evangelical experience, I think was a big node in us distancing away from that and saying, you know what, our care and empathy and our sense of justice, actually, it kind of came and it was consistent with our religious beliefs, but then we found that we could have them outside of that too. It wasn't necessary. It wasn't a necessary condition for those things. And so I think we have this sense of care and justice and compassion and empathy as being universal values. First of all, they are universal because they are for everybody, and they can be universalized. You can sort of have like an implicit kind of conscience. Kant calls it the demand or the imperative for these things. Yeah. Whereas purity and authority and hierarchy and patriotism, loyalty can't be universalized. They're necessarily conflictual, which I think the conservative admits, because they say it's a tool for societal order and stemming chaos and stuff like that. So they admit that they're functional, they're tools, they're not universals. But I think that maybe it's too simple to say, but it feels to me like it's basically a choice between a universal or a functional morality. Are you going to say that morality is a universal thing that can apply to everybody and can be an implicit demand of everybody to be moral, which means you do something like philosophical ethics or moral philosophy, you're trying to figure out what that is and how it works. Or you say morality is entirely functional, and at that point there really isn't a philosophy of morality. It's basically just a science. How do we sort of implicate this morality so as to help us survive, or maybe gain the most happiness in a sort of hedonic sense? So you end up with like utilitarianism, for instance. But even then, I think you have a hard time justifying why it's good to survive or be happy. But that's a whole nother issue we can delve into a different time.
Which we should.
Definitely.
Yeah, and I just want to say, I think that what you're talking about, and it's so interesting, I think it's why both of us have been attracted to Marx over the years, is because Marx, and I don't remember which text it was, you might tell me if it was on the Jewish question or it was, but he says basically that he was trying to realize the religious, the cry of the oppressed, that sort of thing. He was trying to realize that, but through political means. Because he recognized that when people latch on to religion, it's not because they're fucking idiots. It's because there's genuinely something going on. There's genuinely a cry that is bellowing forth from these individuals. The problem is the only thing that they have the option to grab onto is the hierarchy, right? The authoritarian logic. That's all they got. So he says, I get that, but he wants to deconstruct that and say, but what if we can realize those same cries in a way that builds from the bottom up rather than just latching on to our own constructions from the top down, and then we subsume ourselves under our sort of own fetishized creations. And that's, I think, with us too. I mean, I think Marx is just a heretical Christian, and I know so many Marxists fucking hate that, but I think if you actually look at his trajectory, he started off, I mean, obviously he was Jewish, but he started off studying Christianity, and I think in so many ways kind of similar to the path that you and I have taken and that many others have taken who have found marks through Christianity or through liberation theology or various similar narratives, is that there is a sort of heretical Christianity in what we're saying, and that we are trying to sort of realize those same sufferings that Jesus was appealing to, the same sufferings that Gandhi was fighting for, the same sufferings that MLK was fighting for, the same sufferings that that led to the peasant revolts in Europe, in what was it, the 1500s, 1600s? Those same things are trying to be that there's this commonality, there's this common source that it's coming from, but that we're not trying to latch them onto these external transcendent structures, but rather trying to build systems from the bottom up, from a material base.
Yeah, and I think even just to add to that, religion isn't necessarily historically conservative. In every case, Jesus certainly wasn't on authority and loyalty and purity over justice. It's not pure to walk into the temple and wreck shit. It's not obeying authority to question every religious authority, et cetera, et cetera.
Literally, his entire mission was about combating the religious structures of the day, or the religio-political structures of the day. That's what his whole mission was about. It was an antagonism to conservatism.
Yep. And I think it leaves a lot of strands loose. We can kind of jump on that in future episodes if we want to, for sure.
Yeah. Well, anything you want to sum up with? What do you want to sum up with? Fuck authoritarianism? No.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that we have any conclusion here. This is kind of just been a discussion that goes in all sorts of different vectors, but that one is to say, I think it's important to analyze why people do and say what they do and say in a non-reductive, meaning don't just say, oh, because they're assholes, end of story. But to
or because they're conservatives, or because they're Republicans, or because they're liberals.
Yeah, exactly. And to kind of be objective and say there's differences of moral beliefs here, and that's not degrading anybody to say that's the case. It may be incorrect, and maybe oversimplifying, and all those different things, but it's at least trying to understand why people do what they do. And obviously, we're against authoritarianism, and we're clearly biased in terms of we favor the more liberal side of these moral foundations, and want to sort of erase authoritarianism in general, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're trying to sort of scapegoats or sort of pick on anybody. It's just trying to understand as best we can how things happen, analyze what they are and how they occur, so that we can have a better picture of how to make things better in the future.
Yeah. This conversation got me fired up, Troy.
All right, so for our next segment, we're doing the Sticky Leaves. This is where one of us, namely Austin this week, talks about what's bringing him meaning in a meaningless universe. And since we're doing Super Bowl stuff for the bullshitting segment, he's not allowed to talk about Tom Brady for 5 more minutes.
Oh, God damn it. That's what was giving me meaning. His dimples when he smiles and his butt chin that he has. The thing this week that is giving me meaning, I was talking about it with Troy before we started recording, was I had the opportunity this weekend. I'm living in Dublin, Ireland, but I had the opportunity this weekend to go up to Northern Ireland to canvass to support a political party that I've recently become a member of called People Before Profit, which is an intentionally genuine radical leftist socialist political party that emerged out of the Socialist Workers' Party here in Ireland, which is not the Socialist Workers' Party in the UK, by the way, just so we're clear. Okay? They have some weird shit going on with the history of misogyny and shit like that. That is not the party that we came out of. Even though there was some, I guess in the 70s, there was some sort of connection, but there's not, we're not them. But anyway, so People Before Profit is a genuine socialist party, and they're in an alliance with another group called the Anti-Austerity Alliance that came out of the SP in Ireland, which is the Socialist Party. And so they've kind of merged together in recent years. But they are canvassing in Northern Ireland right now because of the upcoming election to try to gain a couple of seats in the Northern Irish version, if you will, of Congress for Americans. It's called Stormont. And we had a candidate in Derry. There's a guy named Eamon McCann, and then we have a couple candidates in Belfast that we're canvassing for. But Eamon McCann is someone who's already in. He's in Stormont right now, and he's been there for a little while. But because this election is taking place under premature reasons because of a scandal, you can Google it and check it out. That's not really the point. We're trying to make sure that we mobilize his base so that they remember to vote on March 2nd. And if you're listening and you happen to be in Northern Ireland, don't forget to vote March 2nd for Eamon McCann if you are in the Derry area anyway, as your local rep. But the thing that I want to talk about is how special it's been to be a part of a group that is actually politically active. And I just want to talk about the importance of engaging in activism. Last week I talked about the importance of theory. Or 2 weeks ago I talked about how theory was my sticky leaf because it was so lovely to get out of the microcosm or the sort of the micro news and the kind of constant Chinese water torture berating of influx of information from social media and news outlets and whatnot. And now I want to talk about a different approach and how it's wonderful to be engaged and actually do ground level activity with people who are like-minded, and how it really, it really does create a sense of value in those theories that I find so important and that I find so refreshing, and that were kind of like that exhalation that I talked about a couple weeks ago, because there is just something about being with people. I remember Troy and I have a common mentor who, when we were both more in our evangelical phases, a gentleman by the name of John, who is a wonderful, wonderful support for both of us in our younger years. And I remember he told me something once that I thought was so important that stuck with me. He said, Austin, when it comes down to it, people are more important. And he was saying this in the context is that he was studying for his master's degree, and there would be nights when it'd be 3 o'clock in the morning and something would happen, and he'd leave when he had an exam at 7 or 8 in the morning, and he would go help with this church family or these other people. And I'd be like, dude, what were you doing? And he's like, Austin, people are more important. Remember that. Eventually, it's about people. And there's something beautiful about that I think that I forget, I think a lot of times, and I think Troy and I can agree that a lot of theorists, a lot of political discourse, a lot of cultural discussions forget that really people are more important. And to be able to be involved with a group that, one, has deep, deep roots in theoretical analysis of things, but at the same time, just fucking cares preeminently about people, it's been really invigorating to me, and it's been really lovely to participate in. When I was younger, when I was more in my evangelical phases, I used to do like street witnessing, and I would go down to Mexico and build houses, and then before that, with my mom, who's not a Christian at all, my mom and I would go and feed homeless people in Los Angeles. My grandmother was homeless for a really long time. She was paranoid schizophrenic, and she used to like break out of the homes that they would put her in, and so she eventually just ended up living on the streets. And so my mom and my aunt and I would go, and we would go visit with her, and we'd bring her food and give her money and shit like that, because it was just impossible to take care of her. Even if she was at our house, she would leave, and not only that, but she had some violent tendencies. So it was a very strange and tough situation. But I remember my mom and my aunt instilled that in me too. It's about people, man. Like, look at this fucking suffering in the world, and let's engage with people. And I think sometimes that gets lost in the chaos of politics and the chaos of theory and the chaos of activism sometimes. And I think ultimately it's just been really nice to be a part of a group that is reminding me of people as being super important. And that's why the group is called People Before Profit. And I love it. It's really been wonderful, and it's been refreshing. And so for me, that's what given me meaning this week. It was just a lovely experience to go up there and be a part of this group and chat with motherfuckers and drink coffee with them and tell jokes, and then at the same time do serious work. It's like it isn't both. We were dancing and laughing, and at the same time getting into intense discussions with people about important political issues like scandals in politics that are taking hundreds of millions of pounds from the working people. So you can do both. You can enjoy the engagement that you participate in. And yeah, I think Joseph Butler, actually, do you know Reverend Joseph Butler? That's one of the things that he talked about ethically, was the idea that your individual satisfaction is not at odds with community satisfaction or social satisfaction. So it isn't either or. It isn't society first and it isn't the individual first. It's that both of them work together. And I don't agree with Butler in so many ways on how he got there, but there is something just simply about that structural idea, that relational idea, that there isn't an opposition between your own individual satisfaction and social equity or social fairness or social justice or social compassion. That's my sticky leaves.
Yeah, man, so much of our political discourse is based on modern resentment. And it's just so naked at this point. It's not even masked that it's nice to just have moments where you can have interaction with people. And it's even political interaction. It's not based upon just pure vitriolic resentment.
Yeah. You talked about it, was it last week? Or was it the week before where you did your I think it was the week before where you were talking about hypocrisy critique. And ever since you said that, that's all I see. That's like the go-to. That's all anybody does. And it's all based on resentment. Yeah, it's that Nietzschean ressentiment. That's all it is.
No grander vision, no positive vision at all. There's no sense of trying to help the other. It's so horrible.
And so what I wonder is, and for me, this is why this is my sticky leaf this week, is that I wonder if you actually just were to engage and go and work and be with people. You know, like you started back at school this week. You are now going to be engaged to your fucking brains out for the next few weeks. And there's something that's different about that than just if you were a researcher. Like I lose touch sometimes as a researcher because I'm not working with students and I'm not working with people. You know, and it's so easy to sit there and read Jacques Bidet and be like, this is fucking amazing. And then I leave it and then I'm an asshole to people, you know, because you think you know better or something like that. And I'm not saying that I am an asshole. I hope I'm not. But that can be a tendency, right? And so it's so important to just fucking connect with people and hear their stories and listen to them, because even if somebody is on the other side of the political spectrum, the reason they voted for Trump, there's a reason. It may be based on false premises, but let's understand them so that we can try to connect with them and build and then create a positive vision for something better. And I just am so naive to think, and I think it's a good thing, and I don't ever want to lose this naivete, but I believe that we can build from those common grounds.
Yeah, notice that your sticky leaf came from political engagement that happened not on Facebook or Twitter.
Yeah, and that goes to what you've been talking about a little bit too, right? About whether or not, you said that a couple weeks ago, do you think, social media is the platform? And you said, no, it's about, engaging with people actually in the real world.
Yeah, I mean, even just like practically, I'm not sure I could deal with it anymore other than real people in the real world. It's hard when you're even just marginally compassionate person. It's pretty an empathic person. It's pretty hard to hate on people when you're looking them right in the face, unless they're like screaming at you or yelling at you in the first place. But if everyone's coming from someone equal footing, you kind of find some common ground pretty easily. All right, so now you want your reward. Let's get to bullshitting.
Oh, I'm ready, Troy. Are you ready?
Do
you want to remind people? Why don't you remind people? No, you go ahead.
No, I have to actually do it, so you should set it up.
All right, so as most of you know, if you are in America or if you pay attention in any way to American news, because, in the UK now and in Ireland, it's big shit. Super Bowl 51 was this past weekend, and Troy was giving me some shit for my man crush on Tom Brady last week, and so he said, why don't we do a little bet? And the bet was that if the Atlanta Falcons win, I was going to have to do something embarrassing, but if the Patriots win, he was going to do something embarrassing. And let's just say that my boy Tom Brady orchestrated the greatest comeback in the history of National Football League. This is comparable to what LeBron James did last year, coming back from 3-1 to beat the Golden State Warriors single-handedly, just tearing apart. Of course, he had Kyrie that was playing out of his mind too, but just tearing apart that amazing team. Well, Tom Brady did it this weekend, and Troy's punishment is that he had to write a poem singing the praises of my boy Tom Brady. So I'm ready, Troy. Let's hear what you got.
Okay, I think this is pretty good. I think you're gonna like this. So I'm gonna recite the poem and then have you respond to it before I do any sort of explanation or self-analysis.
Okay.
It is written, the rain falls on the righteous and the wicked, but also that the arc of history bends towards justice. And sometimes the evening star is too bright on one night, when arcs and rain and all metaphors disgust us. At least the ATL still has Donald Glover, Outkast discography, and Killer Mike. But championships are owned by beautiful bastards born of the sun. Thomas, Edward, Patrick, Brady, has 5 rings and 4 first names. Yet all I can muster with my last breath, Bernie would have won.
Oh my god, bro. That is brilliant. Oh, I like it because there's a hint of sarcasm in there. Yeah. Maybe not a hint. Maybe there's a saturated amount of sarcasm in there. Oh, Jesus.
It's
especially if you
all
believe
kinds of irony.
Yeah, especially if you understand intertextuality, then you know that all it is sarcasm. God. No, that's perfect, man. That's beautiful. I didn't realize that he had 4 first names.
I had to look that up on Wikipedia, and I was like, yep, this makes sense.
He's got to be Catholic, right? Thomas, Patrick, Edward?
Thomas Patrick,
Edward?
Brady, yeah.
Jesus, he's got to be. That's the most Catholic name I've ever heard in my life. Oh, man. Yeah, good stuff. And Bernie would have won. It is true. Truth.
I thought you'd appreciate that.
Dripping with truth. Dude, I'm not going to lie, though. I do. I feel fucking horrible for Atlanta. The way that the game went down. For those of you that don't know or that don't really give a fuck, just listen for the entertainment factor. The Falcons were winning by 25 points in the third quarter. No team had ever come back from that great of a deficit in a Super Bowl. Matter of fact, it's the 3rd largest deficit to overcome in playoff history in football. So, I mean, it was one of the most remarkable comebacks, and they did it in a quarter and a half, which is basically about 22 minutes. And then, of course, they had to go into overtime, and then they won it in overtime. But it was an insane game. I feel fucking awful for the city of Atlanta. God, man, they had the game. You know, when you're up 28-3, there is no way that you should fucking lose that game, man.
I know, man. Crazy.
Oh, God.
I actually watched the fourth quarter just because I was so gleeful that the Patriots were getting their asses kicked. And just...
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know much about football, but Brady just completely ran down the field practically. Just complete... What did he do, 12 completions in a row or something at one point? And it was just ridiculous.
Yeah. It was... it was insane. It was insane. I will say this, though. It was, in a lot of ways, you have to remember, too. So, Tom Brady was suspended for the first 4 games of this season because of accusations over the team deflating footballs to give them an advantage, right? Now, there's a lot of hubbub. And basically, from what I understand, right, and I'm no fucking expert, from what I understand, the investigation into this was in many ways a witch hunt. Now, the Patriots have a shady history. They have been caught cheating in the past. They got caught a few years back recording the other team's practices, and so you would obviously get an idea of their formations so that you would understand when it comes to game time exactly what it was that they were doing. They got in trouble for that, and then this year there was another accusation, and then, of course, there are always just accusations around the league. But then again, as a lot of professional players say, every team fucking cheats, you know? So, some stadiums were pumping in extra sound to make it louder so that when the other team was on the field, they couldn't communicate with each other. So, I mean, there's always cheating in professional sports, right? Like Jerry Rice talked about how he used stickum on his hands to try to, catch footballs. And he's, the greatest receiver of all time. And then it's oh, great, so he had sticky shit on his hands. No wonder he was catching the ball, you know? So there's always professional sports. To talk about professional sports is to talk about a history of people trying to gain a competitive advantage, you know, performance-enhancing drugs, whatever. Stealing signs from the other team. In baseball, that's a big thing, right? You try to steal the signs from the other club so that you can anticipate what they're doing. They're always cheating, right? Now, that sounds like I'm just trying to justify, and in some ways I am. But in another way, it's because apparently, from what I understand, the investigation into the Deflategate scandal pretty much yielded the conclusion that they had cheated and then it was overturned, and now it's the idea that actually that the balls can deflate naturally because of temperature pressure or because of temperature, which, you know, takes out air pressure and shit like that. I don't know, man. I'm not a fucking scientist. But now basically there's a large contingency of people that think that the commissioner and that the league were just on a witch hunt to try to punish this team because they had a vendetta against them. Whatever. I will say this. There was a sweetness in the victory because the Patriots, even though they were viewed as the Trump team versus the Atlanta team, which was the Hillary team, there's a sweetness in the fact that the Patriots were the target of the league's and the commissioner's attacks. And so there was a sense of vindication here that they were being attacked by the establishment, and they came back, and they, stuck it to the man, so to speak. And so there is a sense in which, they were kind of both underdogs, or they both had a chip on their shoulder.
I mean,
don't roll your eyes at me.
You think there's an ironic parallel between the Patriots, like the most successful football franchise, the empire of football franchises, thinking they've been like victimized with the fact that the alt-right thinks that like white people, like being a white male is the hardest thing to be in the world.
Yeah, that's true. Except that they were victimized. They were targeted by Goodell and the league. It's been a fact. The Wells report that came out was completely fucking manufactured. It was spurious evidence. There was some shady shit. We don't really know what went on, but it's been pretty much concluded. And the majority of people are now, he wasn't cheating, but yet he was suspended for 4 games. The Patriots had to pay, I think, $1 million fine, which is kind of like chump change, but still. And then they lost draft picks. So they were punished unfairly for something that the consensus of people now agree probably didn't happen. So I get it. I get people are trying so hard to map this game on to the election, because the election is like the paradigm for interpreting everything in the world now. But it's not quite a 1-to-1 comparison.
Yeah, I'm pretty sick of the whole everything is about Trump.
I know.
Like, it's getting to be too much. I just want to move on and like figure out how to make things better in the future. But hey, I don't know anything about football, so if you out there listening, if you think that what Austin is saying is bullshit, at us. I want to hear your side of the story, because I don't know what it is.
Absolutely. All right, let's go to Michael for This Week in Hip Hop.
With first-class legroom, free cocktails for everyone, and a schedule you can depend on.
Hey, what's up, Trump's America? It's This Week in Hip Hop. Michael Burns. I'm here. Glad to be with you. One note at the beginning. I just want you to know this. Anytime you were waiting for Owls at Dawn to come out, and you're thinking like, oh, I need my shit, where is it? And it's late by hours or a day, it is 100% always my fault. And it's terrible that Austin and Troy are so loyal that they deal with my tardiness and my shit. So either thank them if you enjoy This Week in Hip Hop, or if you really hate this and you hate the fact that sometimes a podcast is a day late, you write them and you say, Dear Austin and Troy, what the fuck do you put up with him? But more importantly, we're here. There's music. Most importantly, this is Dilla month, but we just had Dilla Day. We've just celebrated the birthday of Jay Dilla, known by the government as James DeWitt Yancey, known by anyone who listens to hip hop music as, I don't know, the best producer ever. You probably know Dilla. But if you don't think you know Dilla, you definitely know Dilla. He's done production for everyone from The Roots to D'Angelo to The Far Side to Janet Jackson. I bet you've heard of Janet Jackson. To Tribe Called Quest. A bunch of people from Detroit really innovated how hip-hop music was produced and how it could sound, and was constantly pushing himself. But it's a fun day and a fun week and a fun month to remember and celebrate someone that had such remarkable influence on the way the hip hop music happens. Also, of course, a member of Slum Village. There's a fun meme online. It's like a white kid. It says like Jay Dilla forever. Who is Slum Village? If you know what it means when I say Dilla and you don't know what it means when I say Slum Village, get on it. So that's one of my recommendations this week. If you have not listened to it, if you've never listened to Slum Village, listen to Slum Village in general. If you haven't been back around in a bit, go listen to Fantastic, and in particular, Volume 2.1. That's kind of the classic Slum Village record. We have Dilla producing. We have Dilla rapping. It includes what, for my money, is the best Dilla beat ever. And I know this is really basic and obvious, and you're not going to respect me because I didn't say like, oh, deep cut, blah, 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 blah. I love Fall in Love. Fall in Love, Fantastic, Volume 2.1. For my money, is just one of the most beautifully produced pieces of hip-hop music ever. And it is hip-hop music. It's not just a beat. There's something special going on that track. I'm going to be honest. Once I was in a relationship and I got out of that relationship, but one of the reasons is I was kicking it and I put on fall in love, and the young lady who I was dating at the time was like, "What is this? I don't like this music," and that was fucked up and kind of gendered that I made her talk like that. But it really killed me, and I feel like if you don't have something going on in your soul when you hear that beat, you're fucking dead. But something cool that has happened increasingly, is artists are using this time of year to put out tracks to commemorate their love for Dilla, and one of my and this podcast's favorite young producers, Thelonious Martin, out of, you guessed it, Chicago, Illinois. He put out a project this week called A Dozen for Dilla. And as you might imagine, it's a dozen beats for Dilla. Okay? So let's listen to one track from that real quick and we'll move on. But this is a track off of A Dozen for Dilla, Thelonious Martin. Track 5. And as you might imagine, the whole project is a bunch of beats that are clearly influenced by James DeWitt Yancey, who passed away on February 10th, 2006. But go check that project out. It's free, and because since Thelonious Martin's such a good guy, you can listen to it on the internet. Another thing you might want to check out if you are unfamiliar with J Dilla, or in particular if you're familiar with him and you want to go deeper, our friends at OK Player, which has been my favorite hip hop website for years, made a Spotify list called Cheat Sheet J Dilla that has something like over 1,000 songs that were sampled by Dilla. So if you want to go deep, check that out. But it's Dilla week. It's Dilla month. It should always be Dilla day. Check out some Dilla. A track that came out this week that I'm excited about that does not bear direct resemblance or relation to Dilla. But a track came out from Chicago producer Il Brown. I know I'm going back to my old ways and maybe playing too much Chicago stuff. I'm sorry. But a song Friends came out that features G Wiz, BJ the Chicago Kid, produced by Il Brown. But Freddie Gibbs is on it, and Gibbs has the first verse on it, and I was very excited about this. As we all know, Gibbs was detained in Europe for a little bit because of some legal issues that have now been rectified. So I'm excited to hear him back and getting it. So let's listen to a second of this new track, Friends, Il Brown, featuring G Wiz, Freddie Gibbs, BJ the Chicago Kid. Now, if you know me or you don't know me or you just know me through this podcast, if there's two things I like, it is soulful production, particularly by a man in the Midwest, a man or a woman. I didn't mean to gender that. I'm really sorry. But some good soulful Midwestern production, and Freddie Gibbs rapping over that production. I'm always excited about things like that. So check that project out. And I think, I don't know about you, but in general, I'm pretty excited to check out Il Brown's forthcoming EP called Don't Forget the Dope. So that's going to come out. I'm just going to have some tracks featuring people like Slim Thug, Casey Veggies, Bun B, Dom Kennedy. Dom Kennedy, who is more divisive than Dom Kennedy? I know people that sort of like not be your friend anymore if you like Dom Kennedy, so I'm not going to give an opinion. The last track, we'll listen to a second of it as well. One of my biggest rap guilty pleasures is Rick Ross. It just is. I can't help it. Rick Ross put out a song this week. It's called Summer 17. And I like this better than Summer 16. Listen to a second of it. Another one that's available online to listen to for free. Wow. But that's it for this week. There's a couple tracks that I was excited about that I wanted you to hear. I wanted to talk for a little bit about Dilla. I wanted to tell you about the Thelonious Martin project. But this week, if nothing else, I would say spend some time and go back and listen to some music produced by the hands of the genius James DeWitt Yancey. Whew. And I'm very jealous if you live in a city right now that's going to have a Dilla Day festivity. I spent a lot of years going to the one in Baltimore. That was always my favorite night of the year. So look it up. Most major cities in Estados Unidos we'll have some sort of Dilla Day celebration with various MCs, DJs, producers, and you don't know, you might get to meet Ma Dukes, Dilla's mom. I got to meet her once, and once I got to buy a donut from Dilla's uncle. I don't know shit about donuts from Dilla's uncle. But seriously, thanks for being here on Owls at Dawn. Thank you for sticking around in the pod long enough to listen to me talk about hip-hop for 8 minutes and change. Thank you to Austin and Troy for everything they do for the internet. And most importantly, thank you to, let's see, whoever invented bagels. I'm on a big bagel kick right now, so shouts to that guy. I'm Michael Burns. Hit me up at Twitter, at Nick O'Brien. I'll catch you next week. Bye. Make love, not war.
All right, so thanks for that, Michael. Listen to some JD, some J Dilla, Austin.
You know, I dig Dilla. Michael actually turned me on to Dilla years ago, and I've only really ever heard. Obviously, I've heard some of his beats from some of the artists that he's collaborated with, but there was one album that he put together, and I think you might know better. I think he produced it while he was in his hospital bed. Does that sound right?
Oh, I don't know.
Oh, okay. And it's got this one track in particular that features D'Angelo and Common, and the song's called So Far To Go, and it is the sexiest song I have ever heard. And I mean that not in like, it's not dirty, it's not like 112 fucking Peaches and Cream or Anywhere or anything like that. It's just straight up smooth and steamy and sensual, and yeah, it's a little dirty, but fuck, man, that's on repeat for my baby making playlist that I have on my iTunes. No, I don't really have a baby making playlist. See there, I told you I'm a little bit of a douche. God damn it.
You know what I think the sexiest song ever made is?
Is it like a metal song by Ne Obliviscaris or whatever that band is called?
No,
isn't that what they're called?
Yeah, there's Ne Obliviscaris. Yeah, but that's not sexy music. That's like library metal.
Yeah, I didn't know if you were going to try to go dark with it. So, no. What's the sexiest song?
Sexiest song ever made is Mr. Bungle's "Squeeze Me Macaroni."
It doesn't sound sexy.
It's full of all metaphors for sex and masturbation, and it's very funny.
So it's not really sexy.
I think it's pretty sexy.
That's because you're what do they call a sapiosexual?
Oh my God, no.
Yeah, no, I dig Dilla. Again, I feel like I can't remember the name of the group that Michael was talking about. What was it called? Like, if you don't know, Silo,
Slum Village.
Slum Village. Yeah, I see. I'm one of those white dudes. It's like, yeah, Dilla, Slum Village, who? You know, because I'm still learning. You know, but we can call this the re-education of Austin Smith. Is what this whole project is about.
Yeah, I'm with you, dude. I mean, I know Dilla mostly from his work with Tribe. And that was mostly in their later period, so I never really got super into Dilla's work other than like Donuts and his stuff with Madlib, the really popular stuff. So I got to go back and check out Slum Village stuff and all that.
Yeah, for sure. But I'm down. I mean, from what I understand, man, Dilla days, Dilla months, Dilla life. That sounds good to me.
Yeah, I'm about that.
Sweet. All right, man. Well, anything else we need to say to cap off this episode?
Just want to encourage you all out there to check us out on Instagram and Twitter at owls_at_dawn. You can also throw us an email at owlsatdawnpodcast@gmail.com. And if you have the time, feel free to go to iTunes and drop us a 5-star rating and a review. We'd really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you very much, people. We love you.
Yep. Das Vidania, Amerikanski.